Hello everyone, this is a video response to Julie Borowski's 10 questions for liberals. Now, I haven't been a liberal for years. I've been a libertarian for give or take about 7 of those years, and maybe at some point I'll go into more detail as to how I changed. But anyway, I still remember what it was like to be one and thought I'd maybe give some answers to these questions anyway, even though most of them no longer apply to me, as I guess somewhat of a thought experiment.
Gun ownership is rising among women and minorities in the age of Trump. Do you believe these people have a right to defend themselves with guns?
In my more left-wing days, my answer would have been yes, but would have had some caveats that would have rendered my position contradictory and hypocritical, with the most important being that I supported banning guns completely. At the time, I saw gun tragedies as a result of a culture which glorified guns, which in turn was part of a larger cultural problem that glorified the use of violence. Simply put, I took a look at America's high crime rate and Europe's low crime rate, and compared their gun laws and fell victim to correlation equals causation fallacy. Most gun control supporters tend to view this issue through an emotional rather than a logical lens, and I was no exception. It was realizing that gun control not only doesn't work, but violates due process, as well as relying heavily on government violence to enforce, that I began to realize that my position on the issue helped perpetuate rather than prevent violence.
Can you acknowledge the difference between banning birth control and not forcing somebody to pay for it?
Even in my more liberal days, I had a strong disgust toward abortion, which is probably partly due to my Catholic upbringing, not entirely, though. I did reluctantly support its legalization with heavy restrictions due to the coat hanger argument getting to me, though I eventually rejected that out of hand. Why I bring this up is because that was one of the main reasons why I at the time supported using taxpayer funds to fund birth control. My understanding was that more birth control and more access to it could mean fewer abortions. But now that I know a bit more about economics, I know that government subsidization of products often makes them more expensive, in part due to increased demand, and in part because there's less incentive for manufacturers to make these products affordable. And though I still support birth control, even if I may no longer support forcing taxpayers to fund it, I also began to see how this position, like forcing tax, was not much different from forcing taxpayers to fund abortion, because it was also backed by statist coercion, even if my intentions were good.
Over 60% of babies believed to have Down syndrome are aborted in the US. Is that not ableism?
It is, and that was one of the main factors that led me to taking a pro-life position. As I answered the previous question, even in my more liberal days, I had a strong disgust toward abortion, and the fact that half the arguments used to justify it are based in part or whole on eugenics furthered that disgust. While I don't have Down syndrome, I do know people personally that have it and have been involved in disability rights advocacy for years, in part due to my own experiences on the autism spectrum. Now, I can attest to the fact that while great progress has been made, that ableism is still with us, though sadly some of the disability rights and autism communities have ironically become guilty of ableism due to drinking the SJW identity politics Kool-Aid, though I suppose that's a story for another video.
How can creative, free-spirited people support socialism, a top-down approach that crushes individualism?
I never regarded myself as a socialist, but did understand the appeal. Socialism is one of those things that sounds great on paper. It has a nice-sounding name and sounds just and compassionate, but actually really isn't when you go down to practice. A lot of people on the left and even the right support some socialistic policies without even realizing it, and I was no exception. What we have today in America may be a mixed economy, as they call it, rather than pure socialism, but I won't deny that public support of socialism has increased. If I stayed liberal, it's not guaranteed, though fairly likely I might have described myself as a democratic socialist, in the vein of Bernie Sanders. It was on economics where I was furthest to the left, though it was also economic reasons that first prompted me to become a libertarian in the first place. To make a long story short, the Wall Street bailouts of 2008 really pissed me off, and Ron Paul eventually made too much sense for me to ignore. It took 2 years or so for it to fully sink in, but it was in that moment that I realized that the system is a complete fraud.
Many say that the rich don't pay their fair share in taxes, yet the top 20% pays 84% of income taxes. What exactly is fair share?
In my more liberal days, I would define fair share as the higher the taxes on the rich, the better, though my red pilling made me realize that the quote-unquote rich tends to more often than not actually mean the competition and the middle class. The system is rigged to favor criminals that buy off politicians at the expense of any potential competition they face, as well as the middle class that's stuck with most of the tax burden. Currently, the only tax I would support on the federal level would either be a flat tax or a sales tax on non-essential goods, where a fair share would only be based on how much you spend. Such a position isn't popular with ANCAPs, who frequently state that taxation is theft, but I'm more of a minarchist libertarian rather than an ANCAP.
Do you really trust the Trump administration to have control over your health care?
My answer even back then would have been no, though I probably would have trusted Bernie with it, but probably not Hillary due to me even back then having frustrations with the Democratic Party establishment. It didn't occur to me as much back then as it does now just how dangerous it is to give the government that much power for something like healthcare. I viewed our healthcare system as immoral and inhumane, and still do, but the difference now is I understand that it got that way because of government intervention, and not because we don't have enough or the wrong kind of intervention. Simply put, now I view the free market as the answer instead of big government.
Isn't it hypocritical that Bernie Sanders, who preaches democratic socialism, has 3 houses?
Yes, though I admit I probably would not have seen it that way back then. My rationale would have been something to the effect of, well, he's trying to help the poor and the middle class. As a quick confession, I knew his democratic socialism wasn't the answer. I did once respect him because I thought that even if his proposed policies are terrible, that his heart was at least in the right place, unlike Hillary, who's one of the most corrupt candidates who ever ran for president. Now, that doesn't mean I supported his candidacy, because like I said, his policies are pretty terrible. Now, I actually supported Rand Paul and was originally going to support Gary Johnson, but didn't after I found out that he's a status pretender, though that's a bit of a long story that's too long to explain now. Now, my loss of respect for Bernie started after he sold out and supported Hillary despite the fact that he knew that Hillary stole the primary from him. And when statements he made praising socialist dictators like Castro came out, I sort of began to understand why so many conservatives and libertarians viewed him with such contempt.
Anti-discrimination laws say that wedding vendors cannot deny services to gay couples, but wouldn't you prefer that these business owners expose themselves as homophobes so you know who not to give your money to?
That was actually the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back that lost Gary Johnson my support. Even in my more liberal days, though, I would have been horrified at the extreme leftists that are trying to force gays to cater gay weddings. I probably would have maintained my support for most other anti-discrimination laws, though, due to fears of us going back to Jim Crow days if we ever questioned them. Of course, libertarians don't want to go back to Jim Crow, but taking this to its logical conclusion will be difficult to convince even many conservatives to do. Though it is an important matter because it deals not only with freedom of association, but also freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. I, like most Americans in general, didn't understand the difference between discrimination on private property, as repugnant as that does fall under freedom of association, and, of course, discrimination by the state, which is tyranny because the government, at least in theory, is supposed to represent all of us.
Why do so many liberals want to ban controversial speech? Do they think only speech from the right is going to be targeted? Remember, the government has a history of cracking down on anti-war and far-left speech.
Even in my more liberal days, I would have been just as disturbed and baffled as you are. Freedom of speech issues were among the ones I cared about the most, even back then. Even in those days, I supported the right of organizations like the KKK to hold rallies. Even as repugnant as I found and still find that organization to be, I understood that even allowing them to have their free speech was just as important as allowing me to have mine. One of the reasons why I was a liberal is because I viewed them as being much better on free speech and social freedom than conservatives, though now I see that they're just as bad and possibly worse.
Will you admit that raising the minimum wage will price some unskilled and young workers out of a job?
I can see that now. Though it would have gone from one in one ear and out the other back in the day, because though I realize that wages haven't kept up with inflation, which is true, I didn't know that the Federal Reserve or the fact that our dollar is backed by nothing. Recognizing this and how it harms the poor and the middle class by wiping out their savings was one of the most significant factors in my transformation into a libertarian. This brings me to one of my main reasons for making this video, and it's that most libertarians didn't start out that way. Some, like me, came from the left, though I'll admit I've gone a bit to the right within the last year, thanks in large part to SJWs. And of course, also some came from the right. Somewhere along the way, we realized that mainstream politics doesn't work, that government isn't the answer to every problem and wants something different. Poll after poll shows most Americans are profoundly displeased with the way things are going, yet most of them continue to support the same policies which led to their displeasure. I guess this and other videos that do are my small part in reversing this trend and swinging that pendulum in the direction of liberty. Anyway, thanks for listening.